when the silver lining's after you, don't you turn around away. Baby, it could be too late. I was there the day your world turned. I was there back when your heart burned. Don't you trade away your love for hate, 'cause baby, it could be too late. I still remember how the song went, how we lived our days from rent to rent. So don't you turn around away, 'cause baby, it could be too late. 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 When the silver lining's after you, don't you trade away your love for hate, 'cause baby, it could be too late. Baby, it might be too late. Baby, it could be too late.
had a mission. It was to find love, that special feeling that I once lost. I was driving in my spaceship. I could almost see that airstrip. I was going down for landing, 'cause I finally found my home. I'm like an alien in love, 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 love. I'm like an alien in love, love, love.
when the silver lining's after you, don't you turn around away. Baby, it could be too late. I was there the day your world turned. I was there back when your heart burned. Don't you trade away your love for hate, 'cause baby, it could be too late. I still remember how the song went, how we lived our days from red to red. So don't you turn around the way, 'cause baby, it could be too late. 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 When the silver lining's after you, don't you trade away your love for hate, 'cause baby, it could be too late. Baby, it might be too late. Baby, it could be too late.
Keep your love alive. don't know how you found the time, making all that speed while running down that line. Keep it love alive. It's a tricky thing. You gotta let it fly. You gotta get it in wings. If you wanna make it right, lose and pride. Don't hold on too tight. You know you gotta try. Keep it love alive.
love, find love. That special feeling that I once lost. I was driving in my spaceship. I could almost see that airstrip. I was going down for landing, 'cause I finally found my home. I'm like an alien in love, 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 love.